Long before demons became fixed figures in later theology, ancient scripture spoke in quieter, more ambiguous terms about the presence of hostile forces in the world. The earliest biblical texts do not open with a catalog of demons, nor do they present a structured hierarchy of evil spirits. Instead, they reflect a developing worldview in which disorder, danger, and spiritual threat were understood through language shaped by history, geography, and lived experience. The Hebrew Bible emerged within a landscape already crowded with gods, spirits, and unseen powers. Across the ancient Near East, societies explained illness, madness, drought, and sudden death by appealing to malevolent supernatural agents. Mesopotamian texts describe spirits that stalk deserts and ruins, while West Semitic cultures spoke of night beings and destroyers that moved beyond human control. Israelite religion did not arise in isolation from these ideas. It formed in conversation with them, often redefining or demythologizing concepts inherited from surrounding cultures. In the oldest layers of biblical tradition, what later generations would call demons appear indirectly. They are not named as a unified class, nor portrayed as rebels against a divine ruler. Instead, they surface as forces associated with desolation, impurity, or chaos. Wilderness imagery is especially prominent. Deserts are depicted as places where order breaks down, where life recedes, and where threatening beings are imagined to dwell. This reflects both physical reality and symbolic thought. The wilderness was dangerous, unpredictable, and beyond the structures of human society. Language plays a decisive role in this early stage. Hebrew terms that would later be translated as demons often carried broader meanings. Some referred to foreign deities worshipped by other nations, others to personified calamities, and still others to shadowy spirits associated with death or disease. These terms were not part of a single system. They functioned as poetic or theological tools, expressing the belief that forces opposed to life and covenant existed, even if their precise nature remained undefined. Equally important is what these texts do not say. There is no clear origin story for demons in early scripture. No account explains when they were created, how they fell, or why they oppose humanity. Evil is present, but it is not yet personalized in the later sense. Harmful spirits are instruments, symbols, or consequences rather than independent actors with biographies. This restraint reflects an early theological priority. Ultimate power belongs to one God, and no rival force threatens divine sovereignty. Historical context helps explain this approach. Early Israelite religion was fiercely monotheistic in its self-understanding, especially in contrast to neighboring traditions. To acknowledge powerful autonomous evil beings risked undermining that core conviction. As a result, hostile forces were often absorbed into broader categories: agents permitted by God, manifestations of judgment, or remnants of chaotic space beyond sacred order. Yet these early texts laid essential groundwork. By naming dangerous spirits, associating them with ruins and exile, and linking them to moral and ritual disorder, Scripture created conceptual space for later reflection. As Israel's history unfolded through conquest, exile, and return, these fragments would be re-examined and expanded. The question of where evil spirits come from did not disappear. It waited, unresolved, within the text itself. What follows in later centuries is not a sudden invention, but a gradual clarification. As historical trauma intensified and intellectual exchange increased, ancient writers began to ask more pointed questions. If destructive spirits exist, what is their origin? Are they created, corrupted, or leftover remnants of a broken world? The earliest scriptures do not answer these questions directly, but they prepare the ground on which those answers would eventually be built. As Israelite thought matured, the language used to describe hostile spiritual forces became more precise, though still far from systematic. The Hebrew scriptures began to preserve traces of older beliefs while reshaping them within a developing theological framework. These traces reveal a world in which danger and disorder were not abstract concepts, but lived realities expressed through symbolic beings and poetic imagery. Several ancient terms deserve careful attention, not as fixed technical labels, but as windows into early perception. Some words refer to spirits associated with desolation, ruins, or wastelands, reinforcing the link between hostile forces and places abandoned by human life. Others describe beings connected to disease, terror, or sudden death. In many cases, these terms overlap with names of foreign deities or mythic figures known from neighboring cultures. Rather than denying their existence outright, biblical authors often strip them of divine status and reframe them as subordinate or empty powers. This process reflects a deliberate theological strategy. By reinterpreting the gods and spirits of other nations as powerless or malignant entities, Israelite writers asserted the supremacy of their God without ignoring the spiritual vocabulary familiar to their audience. What had once been worshipped became, in biblical imagination, a symbol of error, danger, or moral deviation. In this way, early demon-like figures functioned as polemical tools as much as metaphysical claims. The wilderness remains central in these descriptions. Deserts, ruins, and borderlands are repeatedly associated with threatening beings. Such locations existed outside the rhythms of agriculture, law, and worship. They were liminal spaces where the protections of community did not apply. To populate these regions with hostile spirits was not merely superstition, it was a way of articulating the fragility of human order and the risks of separation from sacred structure. Importantly, these spirits were rarely portrayed as acting independently. They appear as agents of testing, punishment, or consequence. In some traditions, harmful spirits are sent or permitted to afflict individuals or communities, not as rivals to divine authority, but as instruments within a broader moral order. This idea complicates later assumptions about demons as purely rebellious or autonomous beings. In early scripture, spiritual threat and divine governance are not yet in open conflict. Literary form also matters. Poetry, prophetic vision, and wisdom literature employ heightened imagery to describe fear, suffering, and injustice. Hostile spirits often emerge in these contexts, not as literal characters with defined identities, but as personifications of chaos. Darkness, wind, plague, and madness are given shape through language that blurs the line between metaphor and belief. For ancient audiences, this ambiguity was not a flaw. It reflected the complexity of their world. By the end of this phase, a tension had taken root. On one hand, Scripture maintained strict monotheism and resisted the idea of independent evil powers. On the other, lived experience demanded explanation for pervasive suffering that did not always align neatly with moral cause and effect. The seeds of later demonology lie in this tension. As historical circumstances intensified and theological questions sharpened, writers would seek more explicit answers. The vague figures of early texts would not remain vague forever. The Babylonian exile introduced a profound rupture in Israelite history, reshaping theology as much as national identity. Displacement, imperial domination, and the destruction of sacred space forced ancient writers to confront questions that earlier generations could leave unresolved. In this environment, ideas about hostile spiritual forces began to change, becoming more explicit and structurally defined. Exile brought sustained exposure to Mesopotamian intellectual traditions. Babylonian and Assyrian cultures possessed elaborate systems describing malevolent spirits, demons of disease, night attackers, and wandering entities blamed for misfortune. These beings were cataloged, named, and ritualized through incantations and protective texts. Jewish scribes and thinkers living in or near these cultures could not avoid encountering such frameworks. The encounter did not produce imitation, but it did provoke reinterpretation. Rather than adopting foreign demonologies wholesale, Jewish literature absorbed select concepts and refashioned them within a monotheistic worldview. Evil spirits were no longer merely poetic expressions of chaos or metaphorical dangers of wilderness. They increasingly appeared as discrete entities with functions, limitations, and moral significance. This shift marks a crucial transition from symbolic language to explanatory narrative. At the same time, exile intensified reflection on the problem of suffering. Catastrophe had struck the nation as a whole. not merely isolated individuals. The destruction of Jerusalem and the Temple demanded explanations that extended beyond personal sin. Writers began to explore cosmic dimensions of disorder, asking whether unseen forces contributed to corruption, violence, and injustice on a global scale. The idea that spiritual transgression might precede or amplify human wrongdoing gained traction. This period also witnessed greater interest in the unseen realm itself. Heavenly councils, angelic messengers, and spiritual intermediaries appear with increasing clarity in post-exilic texts. As the structure of the heavenly world became more detailed, so too did conceptions of its darker counterparts. If order existed above, disorder required explanation. Evil was no longer confined to earthbound metaphors. It was increasingly traced to breaches in the cosmic order. Crucially, these developments did not abandon divine sovereignty. Even as hostile spirits gained clearer identity, they remained constrained. They operated within boundaries, subject to judgment and limitation. This balance allowed writers to address the reality of pervasive evil without introducing a rival power equal to the divine. The universe remained governed, but no longer simple. By the close of the exilic and early post-exilic period, the conceptual ground had shifted. The question was no longer whether harmful spirits existed, but where they came from and why they persisted. Older language proved insufficient. New narratives would soon emerge to fill these gaps, offering origins rather than descriptions. It is within this intellectual climate that some of the most influential explanations of demonic origins were composed. In the centuries following the exile, Jewish literature expanded beyond the boundaries of the biblical canon, producing texts that addressed questions Scripture had left open. These writings, later classified as apocryphal or pseudepigraphal, did not seek to replace canonical tradition. Instead, they functioned as interpretive laboratories, exploring unresolved problems such as the origin of evil, the persistence of violence, and the role of the unseen world in human history. A decisive shift occurs in this body of literature. Hostile spirits are no longer treated merely as abstract forces or permitted agents. They are given histories. Authors begin to ask not only how evil operates, but how it began. The answer increasingly points upward rather than outward, locating the source of corruption in a breach of cosmic order rather than in human society alone. These texts reflect a growing conviction that the moral chaos observed on earth mirrors an earlier disruption in the heavenly realm. The world is violent because something has gone wrong beyond it. This idea marks a profound theological development. Evil is no longer explained solely through covenantal failure or foreign influence, but through transgression at a cosmic level that predates or entangles humanity itself. Within this framework, demons emerge as residual beings, neither fully divine nor merely symbolic. They are tied to acts of forbidden knowledge, unlawful descent, and boundary violation. The language used to describe them suggests permanence and consequence, rather than momentary affliction. Once introduced into the world, these entities cannot simply be dismissed. They linger as reminders that cosmic disorder has enduring effects. Importantly, these writings do not present demons as equals to divine authority. Even in their most elaborate narratives, hostile spirits are portrayed as products of judgment rather than independent creators of evil. Their existence testifies to transgression already condemned. This preserves continuity with earlier monotheistic commitments, while allowing space for a more complex explanation of suffering. Scholars have long noted that this period represents a turning point in Jewish demonology. The shift is not abrupt, but it is unmistakable. Where earlier texts hinted, later ones narrate. Where Scripture remained restrained, interpretive literature becomes explanatory. By the time these traditions circulated widely, the idea that demons originated from a specific ancient catastrophe had taken firm hold in the religious imagination. This development prepares the ground for one of the most influential narratives in the history of demonology. A story that would define not only the origin of demons, but their nature, purpose, and fate. That narrative centers on a group of heavenly beings whose actions were said to fracture the boundary between heaven and earth, leaving consequences that neither realm could fully contain. Among the interpretive traditions that emerged during this period, the narratives surrounding the Watchers occupy a central position. Preserved most fully in ancient Enochic literature, these accounts offer the most explicit explanation for the origin of demons found in Jewish antiquity. They do not present speculation in isolation, but a sustained attempt to interpret earlier scriptural fragments through expanded narrative logic. The Watchers are described as heavenly beings assigned to oversee the world. Their transgression lies not in rebellion against divine authority in the abstract, but in violation of established boundaries. They descend unlawfully, acquire forbidden knowledge, and transmit it to humanity. This knowledge includes practices associated with violence, domination, and corruption, altering the moral trajectory of human civilization. The emphasis in these texts is not merely on disobedience, but on consequence. The Watchers' actions produce a world destabilized by excess, injustice, and bloodshed. Human violence is no longer viewed as arising solely from moral weakness, but as amplified by illicit instruction. Evil becomes systemic, embedded in culture and technology, rather than confined to individual choice. From this framework emerges a critical distinction. The Watchers themselves are not identified as demons. They are transgressors who face judgment and confinement. Demons, by contrast, are portrayed as the aftermath of their actions. This distinction is essential. It shifts the focus away from fallen angels as the primary threat and toward the enduring residue of their interference. The narrative thus reframes the problem of evil spirits. Demons are not rebels actively opposing divine order by choice. They are displaced entities born of violation. Their existence is portrayed as unnatural, unresolved, and unstable. They inhabit the space between worlds, belonging fully to neither heaven nor earth. This explanation offered ancient readers a way to reconcile divine justice with ongoing suffering. Judgment had already occurred, yet its effects persisted. Evil was not unaddressed, but its consequences had not been fully removed. The presence of demons became evidence not of divine absence, but of a world still bearing the scars of cosmic rupture. By grounding demonic origin in a specific event, rather than an eternal dualism, these texts preserved monotheism while accounting for pervasive corruption. The Watcher's narrative does not multiply gods or powers. It explains disorder as the result of unlawful knowledge and breached limits. In doing so, it provided a framework that would profoundly influence later Jewish and Christian understandings of demons, shaping how evil spirits were defined, discussed, and confronted for centuries to come. The narrative logic of the Watchers reaches its most consequential development in the explanation of what followed their judgment. Ancient texts describe the destruction of the giants born from the Watchers' transgression as an act of restoration, intended to halt escalating violence and corruption. Yet this act does not resolve the problem entirely. Instead, it gives rise to a new category of beings whose existence explains the persistence of evil after divine intervention. These beings are described as spirits that emerge from the dead giants. They are neither heavenly nor fully human, but remnants of a forbidden union that violated cosmic boundaries. Because their origin is anomalous, they lack a proper place within the created order. This condition defines their nature. They wander, disrupt, and afflict, driven by an unresolved state of existence rather than by ideological rebellion. This explanation marks a decisive shift in demonology. Demons are no longer associated primarily with foreign gods, metaphors of chaos, or abstract forces of destruction. They are the byproduct of judgment itself. Violence begets judgment, and judgment leaves residue. In this framework, demons exist because the world has been corrected, but not yet healed. The behavior attributed to these spirits follows logically from their origin. They seek embodiment because they lack stable form. They influence humans because they were once tied to human flesh. Their association with sickness, obsession, and moral distortion reflects an attempt to reclaim what they lost. This interpretation accounts for why demons are portrayed as parasitic rather than creative, destructive rather than generative. Importantly, these texts do not portray demons as strategic masterminds of evil history. They are reactive, not sovereign. Their power is limited, temporary, and ultimately destined for removal. This preserves a moral hierarchy in which divine justice remains intact, even while the present world remains compromised. Scholars have noted that this model offers a rare internal coherence. It explains why evil persists without attributing it to divine failure or eternal dualism. It also explains why demons are feared but not worshipped, resisted but not negotiated with as equals. They are symptoms of an ancient wound rather than rulers of a competing kingdom. By articulating demons as spirits born from destroyed giants, Second Temple literature provided one of the most influential origin theories in religious history. This explanation would echo through later interpretations, shaping how evil spirits were understood not as fallen gods, but as the lingering consequences of a world that had once crossed a boundary it was never meant to cross. The traditions describing the origin and nature of demons did not remain uniform or uncontested. Within Jewish literature of the late Second Temple period, multiple interpretive streams coexist, reflecting different attempts to integrate inherited narratives with evolving theological concerns. These variations do not contradict the core framework, but they reveal how flexible and adaptive demonology had become. Texts preserved among the Dead Sea Scrolls illustrate this diversity with particular clarity. Some writings emphasize demons as agents of moral testing, linked to human inclination and ethical failure. Others portray them as cosmic forces aligned with darkness, participating in an ongoing struggle between order and corruption. Yet even in these formulations, demons remain subordinate, constrained, and ultimately temporary. Targums and later interpretive traditions further refine these ideas. Biblical passages that originally employed ambiguous or poetic language are reinterpreted with greater specificity. Vague references to spirits or destructive forces are clarified, sometimes explicitly identified as demonic beings. This process does not invent new entities so much as sharpen existing ones, translating ancient imagery into clearer explanatory terms for new audiences. One notable development is the moralization of demonic activity. Demons are increasingly associated with deception, impurity, and temptation, rather than random disaster alone. This reflects a shift in ethical focus. Evil is no longer understood solely as external affliction, but as something that interacts with human choice and behavior. Demons influence, but they do not compel. Responsibility remains human. At the same time, some traditions preserve an almost administrative view of demons. They are described as operating within assigned domains, subject to oversight, and limited in scope. This bureaucratic portrayal mirrors the increasingly structured vision of the heavenly realm found in late Jewish thought. Order above implies order even among forces of disorder. Despite these differences, a shared assumption persists. Demons are not primordial beings. They are not co-eternal with the divine. Their origin lies in history, whether cosmic or terrestrial, and their fate is bound to its resolution. This consensus distinguishes Jewish demonology sharply from surrounding dualistic systems that posited eternal forces of light and darkness. By the end of the Second Temple period, the question of demonic origin had largely settled into recognizable patterns. Debate continued over function and influence, but not over legitimacy or ultimate authority. Demons were understood as real, active, and dangerous, yet fundamentally limited. This conceptual stability ensured that when new religious movements emerged, they inherited a demonology already well developed, rather than one still in formation. Part 8. By the time of the early Roman period, the conceptual framework surrounding demons was already firmly established within Jewish thought. The New Testament writings emerge into this environment rather than creating it. Their language, assumptions, and narrative patterns reflect an inherited worldview in which demons are understood as real spiritual entities with defined characteristics and limitations. Accounts of demonic activity in the Gospels do not pause to explain what demons are or where they come from. This silence is revealing. It suggests that the audience required no introduction. Demons are portrayed as disruptive spirits that afflict individuals, distort perception, and fracture social bonds. These descriptions align closely with Second Temple interpretations that emphasized possession, impurity, and moral disorder rather than cosmic rebellion. Notably, the New Testament does not present demons as fallen angels in a systematic sense. The texts distinguish between angelic beings and demonic spirits, often treating them as separate categories. Demons are depicted as restless, seeking embodiment and fearing judgment. This portrayal closely parallels earlier traditions that defined demons as displaced spirits rather than active participants in heavenly rebellion. Exorcism narratives further reinforce this continuity. Authority over demons is exercised not through negotiation or ritual incantation, but through command. This reflects the underlying assumption that demons possess no legitimate standing. They recognize hierarchy, respond to authority, and anticipate eventual confinement. Their behavior is reactive, not strategic. Early Christian writings beyond the Gospels continue this pattern. Demons are associated with deception, idolatry, and moral confusion, but not with creative or sovereign power. They are presented as obstacles to human flourishing rather than architects of cosmic history. This emphasis preserves the Second Temple view that demons are consequences of earlier transgression, not originators of evil itself. Scholarly analysis consistently notes that the New Testament neither systematizes demonology nor introduces new origin stories. Instead, it presupposes an existing explanatory model shared with contemporary Jewish thought. The focus shifts from origin to impact, from cosmology to practice. The question is no longer where demons came from, but how they are confronted and constrained within human experience. This continuity is critical for understanding the historical development of demonology. It demonstrates that later Christian interpretations did not invent demons as theological tools, but inherited a complex and already mature tradition. To understand demons in the New Testament, one must first understand the ancient explanations that preceded it. Part 9. In the generations that followed, early Christian thinkers began to organize inherited traditions into more formal theological frameworks. Drawing on Jewish demonology, Greco-Roman philosophy, and emerging doctrinal concerns, they sought coherence rather than innovation. Their task was not to invent the origin of demons, but to situate existing explanations within a broader vision of cosmic order and redemption. Patristic writers consistently reflect awareness of earlier Jewish interpretations, even when they do not cite them explicitly. Demons are described as spirits opposed to divine purpose, yet their opposition is framed as derivative rather than primordial. They are not creators of evil, but participants in its transmission. This distinction allowed early Christian theology to preserve monotheism while acknowledging the tangible reality of spiritual affliction. A key development during this period is the increasing association of demons with idolatry. Pagan gods are reinterpreted as demonic entities, not in the sense of fallen deities, but as deceptive spirits operating behind false worship. This move echoes earlier Jewish strategies that stripped foreign gods of legitimacy, reframing them as empty or malignant powers. The continuity is clear. What had once been rival deities are now understood as subordinate spirits exploiting human error. At the same time, Christian writers retained the view that demons are constrained by divine authority and destined for judgment. Their activity is temporary, their influence limited, and their future sealed. This eschatological horizon reinforces the idea that demons belong to a transitional phase of history, not to its final state. Evil persists, but it does not endure indefinitely. Importantly, early Christian texts do not resolve every ambiguity inherited from earlier traditions. Questions about the precise relationship between demons and fallen angels remain open, and interpretations vary. Some writers emphasize continuity with Enochic explanations, others adopt more symbolic readings. Yet even in diversity, a common assumption remains intact. Demons are not eternal beings, nor are they autonomous powers rivaling the divine. By systematizing rather than reinventing demonology, early Christianity ensured the survival of ancient explanations while adapting them to new intellectual contexts. The origin of demons remained anchored in history and transgression, not in metaphysical dualism. This anchoring would shape theological discourse for centuries, influencing how evil was explained, resisted, and ultimately placed within a framework of divine justice and final restoration. By the early centuries of the Common Era, the origin of demons had solidified into a coherent explanatory tradition grounded in ancient scripture, interpretive literature, and historical reflection. Demons were no longer vague metaphors for fear or poetic symbols of chaos. They were understood as real, hostile spirits whose existence resulted from a specific sequence of transgression, judgment, and unresolved consequence within the created order. Across this long development, one conclusion stands out with remarkable consistency. Demons are not primordial forces. They are not co-equal with the divine, nor eternal rivals locked in cosmic balance. Their origin is historical, not metaphysical. Whether described through the lens of exile, cosmic boundary violation, or the aftermath of forbidden unions, demons emerge as remnants of disorder rather than architects of it. The ancient explanatory model resolves several tensions simultaneously. It accounts for the persistence of evil without denying divine sovereignty. It explains why hostile spirits are active yet constrained, feared yet never worshipped legitimately. It clarifies why demons are portrayed as restless, embodied in affliction rather than authority, and destined for eventual removal rather than perpetual rule. Equally important is what this tradition resists. It avoids dualism. It rejects the idea of an eternal war between equal powers of good and evil. Instead, it presents a universe fundamentally ordered, temporarily damaged, and ultimately governed. Demons belong to the damage, not the design. Modern readers often encounter demonology through later folklore, medieval imagination, or popular culture. These layers obscure the restrained and disciplined origins found in ancient texts. When those layers are peeled back, the earliest sources reveal a sober attempt to explain suffering, corruption, and spiritual affliction without surrendering coherence or moral responsibility. What emerges from ancient scripture and its interpretive tradition is not a mythology of terror, but a theology of consequence. Demons exist because boundaries were crossed, order was violated, and judgment, though decisive, left traces behind. Their presence testifies not to divine failure, but to a world still in the process of restoration. In this sense, the ancient explanation remains internally consistent and historically grounded. Demons are not mysteries without origin. They are witnesses to a broken chapter in cosmic history, one that ancient writers believed would not be the final word.